Hello, in this video, we'll be going through Treasury stock. A shareholder's equity section of the balance sheet is made up primarily of four different components. There's the paid-in capital, which also includes the common stock and preferred stock, retained earnings, accumulated other comprehensive income, and what's called Treasury stock, which is what we're going to go through today. Treasury stock is when a corporation buys back or repurchases its own stock that has previously sold. So why would companies buy back their own stock? There's several different reasons. One is if management feels that their stock is undervalued, then they may attempt to buy back a lot of stock, and then that usually what that does, it'll drive the price of the stock up because there's less supply, which equals more demand. So the price goes up. Another reason why they might buy it is because it's viewed as a way to distribute company profits without actually paying a dividend. So, like I said before, when they buy back their stock, it drives the price of the stock up, and therefore the current shareholders have more value in their stock because their stock is valued in more, right? Because the price is higher. And so therefore they've essentially, quote unquote, distributed some of the company profits without actually without paying dividends. And there's other times when companies would buy back their shares to offset the increase in shares issued to employees under stock award or stock option compensation programs. So oftentimes with public companies, especially, part of the employee overall compensation package will include some share-based compensation, whether that's a restricted stock or stock option. And when they issue those shares, right, to their employees, then there's more shares out there, so they might buy it back in order to dilute the overall pool and make those shares worth more to their employees. They might also reacquire or repurchase their stock because they're planning to pay out a stock dividend. So a dividend can be paid out in cash, or it can also be paid out in additional stock. That will be a different video. If they need more stock in order to go through a merger where they have to distribute stock as part of that merger, or they can buy back their stock also as a defense against a hostile takeover. So there's not as many shares on the open market for another company to buy. Two different ways to account for a repurchase of stock. One is called treasury stock, and the other is when the shares are formally retired. So what's the difference? Shares are formally retired means that the company buys back that stock and they're not going to resell those same shares. When a company buys back treasury stock as treasury stock, then it's really considered to be one big overall transaction where they buy back the stock and then eventually they will resell it back into the open market. That's what treasury stock is. They buy it back, right? They repurchase it, but then they're going to resell it again at some point. So how do we account for treasury stock? It's viewed as only a temporary reduction of shareholders' equity because, just like I mentioned before, the plan is they buy it back, but then eventually they're going to resell it. So, which is why it's a temporary reduction. And the cost of acquiring the shares is temporarily debited. Okay, so when we buy it back, when we buy the shares back, we debit an account called treasury stock, and it's part of the shareholders' equity account. Remember, when we sell stock, we credit an equity account. We credit common stock or preferred stock and additional paid-in capital. So when we buy back, we're going to debit, and we're going to create a new account called treasury stock. And when a company buys back its stock, on their 10K, you've seen it maybe in a previous video where on the balance sheet in the stockholders equity section, it'll say common stock. It'll say the number of shares authorized, the number of shares issued, which is how many they've sold, and the number of shares outstanding. So the number of shares issued is the amount of shares that the company has sold since the beginning of time, right, for that company. The number outstanding is a number of shares that are actually held by the shareholder. So when they buy back that stock, right, when the company buy back that stock, the number of outstanding shares reduces because it's no longer being held by the shareholders, it's being held by the corporation itself. The number of shares issued remains the same because it's considered to be a temporary transaction, so it's still considered to be, a sold stock because it was originally sold. And then, just like I said, it's all considered to be part of a single transaction. The whole repurchase of the stock and then reselling it back out into the open market. This is how the presentation of a statement of the shareholders' equity section of the balance sheet could be. It would list your common stock, right? Here's the number of shares issued and shares outstanding. You have your additional paid in capital, and you have your retained earnings, and you're going to have a subtotal. And then if a company has treasury stock, right, they've repurchased some of their shares, it's going to be a reduction to the overall shareholders' equity, and then you have a total shareholders' equity. I'm going to go through an example of how to account for treasury stock when a company first purchases its own stock and then goes out and resells it on the back into the open market, because you're going to need to know how to account for all of that. So here's a company on May 1st. They purchased their own company's stock, right? They repurchased their shares, 1,000 shares at $11.50 per share. What we're going to do is we're going to debit this account treasury stock common, because we're buying back common stock, and that is a reduction to the shareholders equity section because it's a debit for on the number of shares times the price that we purchased at. So that's 11,500, and the company actually has to pay for those shares, so the credit is to cash. Now right here, I'm just keeping track of the numbers of treasury shares that I have, right? So right now I have 1,000 treasury shares because I've purchased back 1,000 shares. I'm also going to start right here a T account specifically for the shareholders equity account for the treasury stock, because it'll come into play as we go through this example. Now we're going to go to May 21st. On May 21st, the company sold treasury stock. Okay, so they acquired 1,000 and they sold 100 shares of that treasury stock back out into the market at $11.50 per share. So now, since they sold the stock, they're going to debit cash for the number of shares times 1150, which is $1,150, and they're going to credit this treasury stock common account, right? It's the same one that we created up here on May 1st. So, I'll show you, you'll see why in a little bit, why it's important to keep track of the number of treasury shares when you first buy a bucket of treasury shares at a certain price. You have to keep track of how many of those shares you sell back out into the open market. So now when I track my treasury, the number of treasury shares I have, I purchased 1,000 right here on May 1st, and now I've sold 100 on May 21st, 100 of those shares. And now if I continue with my T account, here's my May 1st debit to my T account for treasury stock for 11,500, but now I've sold some of it, so I have to credit, right? This credit right here goes into this T account credit right there for $1,150 on May 21st. Now I'm going to go to June 3rd. And so on June 3rd, we continued to sell some more treasuries, some more of that treasury stock from that one initial bucket. We sold 400 shares at $12. So I want you to pay attention that now we've initially bought this $1,000 bucket of share, 1,000 bucket of shares at $11.50. Now we're going to sell them back out in the open market for more than what we paid, right? Because we paid $11.50 for them. We're selling them at $12. So we're selling these shares, so we've received cash, right, because we're selling them. So we've sold 400 shares at $12. That's $4,800. So we're going to debit cash for that $4,800. And we're going to credit our treasury stock, as long as we still have a balance in our treasury stock T account, in that account, we're going to continue decreasing it. So we're going to credit the treasury stock for the 400 shares that we just sold, multiplied by the amount that we bought that tranche for, that 1,000 shares. We bought them 1150, so we're going to credit treasury stock for 400 shares times that 1150. And then the rest of it is a plug to paid in capital share repurchase. Oh, let me just increase that right here. Share repurchase, and that's going to be a credit for $200. Again, I'm going to keep track of this tranche of treasury shares right here. I purchased 1,000, now I've sold 100, and I've sold 400, so I still have 500 shares of that tranche remaining. And my T account, I can't tell you how important it is to keep track in a T account for the treasury stock, right? We're going to continue right now. We credit it on June 3rd for $4,600. Again, that's for the same, you multiply the number of shares you sold, multiply by the dollar amount that you actually paid for that tranche. But now on June 3rd, since we created this paid in capital share repurchase account, we also have to keep track of that in a T account, which is what I've done right here. So we have a credit for $200. Okay, so now let's go into July 1st, and we sold treasury stock again. Meaning we sold it back into the open market. We sold the last 500 shares from that tranche, but this time we sold it for $11.10, which is again under my what I originally purchased them for $11.50. So I got cash. I got 500 shares times $11.10 is $5,550. We have to remove the treasury stock at the same cost that we originally purchased that tranche for. So here, the 500 shares, we're going to remove it at $11.50 because that's what we acquired them for. So that's $5,750. And now the difference between the cash and the treasury stock is going to go to my paid in capital share repurchase for $200, okay? And that's only because I have a $200 credit balance sitting in there from my June 3rd transaction. So now I have $200 to fully absorb this $200. So I'm going to debit my paid in capital share repurchase for $200. So this is just an example of when your paid in capital can actually be a debit rather than a credit, because that's what we've seen so far. And that's most of the times for most transactions, that is what you'll see. But when we have a treasury stock that we've purchased and then sold, we can have the situation where we have to debit that account. Now we're still going to work on July 1st, but I'm going to change the facts a little bit. We still have sold our last 500 shares from that treasury stock tranche. But now instead of selling for $11.10, we're still selling it under the amount that we originally purchased it for. But now we're only sold it for $8 a share. So let's go through those entries and see what happens. We're going to debit cash for we sold our treasury stock for 500 shares at $8. So we're going to debit cash for $1,000 because that's what we should get it. Now, let's see, what do we credit the treasury stock? This is the last bit of our tranche, right? This is the last 500 shares. So we're going to still take those 500 shares and we have to remove them at the same cost that we originally acquired that tranche for. So here we're going to take the 500 times $11.50. So we're going to have a credit for $5,750. Now look what happens when I put into my treasury stock T account. Right now I'm at zero because now I've accounted for, I originally purchased the 1,000 shares at this cost and now I've subsequently sold them at 3 different dates for different costs. But when I credit my treasury stock, it's always at the $11.50. Okay. Now I go back to my paid in capital because if I just have a $4,000 debit and a $5,750 credit, obviously that does not balance. I have to debit my paid in capital share repurchase, but you can only debit it to the extent that you have a balance in there. So we created a $200 credit balance on June 3rd. So we can only debit $200 in this account, in this paid in capital share repurchase. So I'm going to have a debit paid in capital share repurchase for $200, and I put max here because that's the maximum I could do it for this transaction. Again, my entry does not balance. So in order to make my entry balance, I'm going to actually debit retained earnings for the plug, which is $1,550. So you can see the different kind of scenarios you can have. When you sell a stock, I'm going to go right back up here, for more than what, if you sell your treasury stock for more than you actually repurchased it for originally, then you're going to have a credit to your equity accounts right here. You're going to have your credit to your treasury stock and a credit to your paid in capital. When you sell that treasury stock back onto the open market for less than what you paid for it, right? Because in this situation we sold it for $11.10, then we can have a credit. We still have a credit to the treasury stock, but we'll have a debit to the paid in capital. And then additionally, if you sell it for a lot less than what you paid for it, or just it really depends on how the numbers work out, you will have that debit to the paid in capital plus potentially a debit to retained earnings. So you're reducing your retained earnings. So you can look at this slide and it pretty much just summarizes exactly what I said. Let's do a concept check. In 2027, Broyles Inc. reacquired 3,000 shares of its common stock as treasury shares at $55 per share. In 2028, Broyles Inc. sold 1,000 shares of the treasury stock at $75 per share. Which of the following would be included in the 2028 entry? So let's just see what happens here. Well, we're told C is the correct answer, but let's go through the entries. In 2027, we paid $165,000 because this is going to be your 3,000 times $55. That's what we repurchased those shares at. So we debit treasury stock for $165,000 and credit cash for $165,000. And then in 2028, so right now, so we have 3,000 shares in 2027 that we purchased, and then in 2028 we sold 1,000. So that's still from this tranche that we bought it for $55. Sorry, it's not working properly. So we bought it. So we're still selling at $1,000 in 2028. So we're gonna credit the treasury stock for the 1,000 shares, right, at $55, which is how we get this credit of $55,000. We sold it for $75. So we sold 1,000 shares and we actually sold it $75. So we're going to debit cash for $75,000 and the rest is a plug. We're going to credit paid in capital share repurchase for $20,000. And so C is the one that fits our journal entry for 2028.